Right. Well, thanks so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined our call this morning. I think we were all coming in hot. I had a meeting prior to this too, and just made it in our office as well. But as Dean said, I'm Tracy Williams. I am a board member for 10 at the Top. I also serve on the marketing committee. And so I've been on 10 at the Top for several years. And so just glad to be a part of this organization and working regionally to help move our top 10 counties forward. So I just want to give a few updates before we get started with our programming. So as I said, welcome to our August 10 at the Top chat. I encourage you to put your name and organization in the chat and feel free to connect with others on the call as you see some other names coming in. And also, if you do not have your call on mute, also encourage you just to do that as well. And so 10 at the Top serves as a convener and connector of sectors and communities across the upstate and around issues that impact our economic vitality and quality of life. And so as Scott and Dean were talking prior to us getting started, they mentioned housing. And so over the last couple of years, 10 at the Top has been involved with affordable housing. We would love to invite you on September the 10th. We will be hosting a South Carolina Housing Development 101, where representatives from the South Carolina Housing will share about key tools for creating, preserving affordable housing in South Carolina. I know Scott mentioned he was going to have a few slides talking about affordable housing, but you can also learn more and register through the link in the chat. Dean, are you going to drop that link in the chat?
I am. I'm dropping it in right now.
Awesome. All right. And so I also hope you can join us September 23rd for a special Upstate Connect session at the Lawrence County Water Tower, where we'll be discussing how infrastructure fuels economic development. And so Dean is also going to be dropping that link in the chat. Once again, that is the Upstate Connect session at Lawrence County Water Tower. Our next Upstate Downtown Academy will be held on September 24th in Woodruff. So this event is limited to only 35 people and is usually always a sellout. So I encourage you, if you're on the call, to register for that. Dean is also going to drop that in the chat. So I suggest that you register for that as soon as possible to make sure there's room for you. And 10 at the Top is very fortunate to have generous and loyal group of funding partners. In 2026, we've already added 7 new partners, along with having several partners increase their level of support. You can see the list of all of our leadership levels on the presentation slide, and a link is in the chat as well to the list of those 100+ funding partners. And I hope that you can join us if you're not already a funding partner. If you're on this call and a funding partner, we thank you so much for your continued support. But if your organization is not a funding partner, we always have room for you to join as well. We're dropping a lot of links in the chat box. So there will also be a link for the 10 at the Top partner benefit information sheet. So that's a little bit about what we've look forward to in the next coming month, but we're really excited and fortunate to have our guest speaker today, Scott Bayer. He is the Associate Dean of Research for the Wilbur O. and Ann Powers College of Business at Clemson University. I think today may be move-in day for some people, maybe over there at Clemson. And so I know it's a busy time over there. We just had our intern. His last day was yesterday, and he is moving in, I think, tomorrow at Clemson. So I know it's a busy time at Clemson right here at the start of the year. But Scott has been giving us an annual economic update since we started 10 at the Top chats in 2020. And we appreciate him joining us to provide a mid-year economic update. So also just want to do a quick reminder, as well as all of those links that Dean has dropped in the chat. If you have any questions, you can also put those in the chat as well. Dean and I, Justine, will be kind of monitoring that chat as we go through. And so now I am going to turn it over to you, Scott. So you have the floor.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to just start sharing my screen. And we'll get started here. All right, this is the right one. Yeah. So again, as you may have heard at the outset, we were talking a little bit about, what are the big changes over the last 10 years, and really there have been several that are impacting the economy. In fact, I could give, and I do have talks separately on how the labor market is being impacted by AI, how the government has changed, what is going on with inflation, how the conflict in Iran is impacting that. So all of those things are big things that are impacting the economy, as well as what is referred to the affordability crisis. So I'm going to try to hit all of those as best I can in this amount of time. So let's see what we can get covered. Let me start with a quick overview of what's going on in the economy. Um, so if we look at, and now I've lost my screen here. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. In 2026, the economy really is defined by a Fed that might be caught between what could be referred to as sticky inflation, relatively low GDP growth, and a cooling labor market, with AI productivity really being the wild card. So again, with low GDP growth and a cooling labor market, that would encourage the Fed to lower interest rates, trying to help move the economy along. But with inflation above its 2% target, in some sense, well above its 2% target, that would more or less lead the Fed to raise interest rates and try to cool that inflation down. So the Fed is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place now. Why AI is the wild card? If AI could really enhance labor productivity and help real GDP growth, that eases some of the pressure on the Fed and also could help bring down inflation some. So again, Fed is stuck right now between a rock and a hard place because of the slower growth and the higher inflation. AI could actually really help out. Again, where are we in terms of real GDP growth? Second quarter GDP growth was 1.5%, below kind of that historic rate of 3% growth that we normally have, even below the 2% that we've been averaging, or 2.25% we've been averaging over the 2000s. It comes on the heel of 2.1% growth in 2026 Q1. And overall GDP growth in 2025 was 2.1%. So again, while the economy is doing okay, it is not growing as fast as what we've experienced in the 2000s, which is roughly about 2.25% GDP growth each year. Job growth is showing some signs of weakness over the last 3 months. The economy has added about exactly 60,000 jobs. Um, Overall, not per month. So far in 2026, the economy has added a total of 426,000 jobs. Again, to think of what a good month would be, kind of average month, the average job growth each month of new jobs added to the economy is about 130,000. So again, there's some weakening right now in the job market. Also, the conflict with Iran has led to elevated oil prices, as we know. That can act as a little bit of a drag on the economy, though we're not as reliant on oil prices and energy as we were in the 1970s. It still does have a drag on the economy. Higher gas prices is putting some upward pressure on inflation. But again, in my view, the top impact of inflation would be roughly about 4 to 4.5%, and we're still hovering right now below that. So the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, the PCE, stood at about 3.7%. Core inflation, if you extract out the more energy and food, which fluctuates a lot more, inflation's been at 3.3%, meaningfully above the Fed's normal 2% target. So again, the Fed is going to continue to try to bring that inflation down. Where does the Fed stand currently? The Fed voted 9.3 in its most recent meeting to hold interest rates between 3.5% and 3.7%. We'll see if some of the more recent news gets them to move off of that. Maybe the cooling of the labor market that was released last Friday will encourage them to maybe cut rates in the future. Again, just a simple graph. I think I include this in all my slides or on the state of the economy. This is real GDP growth from 1947 up to the current issue. And again, you see lots of wiggles here, which captured expansions and recessions. You see the L-shaped kind of recovery coming out of 2008 and the V-shaped recovery coming out of the pandemic. If you kind of focus more in on what's going on more recently over the last few years, what you can see is, again, GDP growth averaging about 2.5%, 3% per year. The one notable thing that sticks out in this graph is the negative GDP growth that occurred in Q1 of 2025. And really what was going on in that instance, remember, that was the quarter prior to the tariffs being implemented. So what we saw was a lot of business activity changing away from where they were planning and trying to get as many of the imports in ahead of the tariffs, and that led to negative GDP growth. Again, the thing I think that's most notable here is the last 3 quarters GDP growth has been a little, what I would say on the sluggish side, 0.5%, 2.1%, and 1.5%. If you look at some of the drivers, and I'm not going to break down all the components of GDP here today, that is consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, just because of time constraints. I'm going to focus on some of the big ones on the demand side. If you look at consumption, which again is 2/3 of GDP, what you see for the most part is consumption from that 50,000-foot view is doing pretty well. Real disposable income is kind of chugging along, growing at about 3% a year, and consumption is growing right along with that. So again, on the surface level, consumers look like they're in pretty good places. Income grows, their consumption is growing right along with that. But underneath that, I think there are some concerns that might show some fragility in the economy. And this is looking at different aspects of debt, household debt here. And there's a couple areas in which you see debt rising dramatically. One is auto loans have been rising for some period of time. More recently, what you see coming around beginning in 2021 is the rise of credit card debt. And then some of the other revolving debt is rising as well. So when you start to see debt rising on the consumer side, you start worrying about our consumers becoming a little bit more stretched, and how sensitive are they going to be to other changes in the economy. And again, in taking a deeper dive on what's going on the consumer side, what it looks like, it doesn't look lying, what it looks like is that high income consumers are helping to carry the economy, while lower income consumers seem to be a little bit more stressed. And this bifurcation looks like is one of the key risks, I think, in the economy going forward. So what's the evidence of this? Consumption growth seems to be more dependent on higher income households than in earlier stages of the recovery. I mean, by recovery, I mean coming out of the pandemic. What we're seeing here are lower income households have depleted excess savings from all the stimulus they received in 2021, 2022, and 23. Most of that was gone by 2023. You could see from that last slide, recent credit card data shows higher. We're also seeing, in addition to the rise in the credit card debt, we're also seeing rising delinquency rates among lower income borrowers and increased use of revolving credit. And then we're also seeing spending growth has been stronger in travel, restaurants, and high-end services and durable goods. And those goods are the ones that are typically bought by higher income consumers. So again, what we're seeing is some of the consumption growth that we're seeing is really being driven more by high income consumers and less by low income consumers. Well, consumption, the aggregate looks good. these are the concerns, I think. Overall consumption, when it's being driven by higher income consumers, it becomes more sensitive to interest rate changes and more sensitive to wealth corrections, changes in the stock market. So again, if I was going to be worried, not only for the sake of some, the kind of the K-shaped economy that people talk about, I'm also worried about changes in asset prices, changes in wealth corrections, changes in interest rates that can disrupt some of the spending that consumers are doing. Real wage gains also for middle income and lower income households would help support this. And again, we're seeing reasonable gains there in terms of real rate wages. If we think about, and again, this is a big concern, nationwide, the affordability crisis, I think it's impacting a lot of the elections that we're seeing across the country. What's driving it? Really, the underlying causes from 2021 to 2023, inflation surged and increased overall prices by roughly 20 to 25%. And the thing that happens when inflation goes up like that, when it's general inflation, those prices don't come back down under normal policy. What we're experiencing now is slower inflation, or what we refer to as disinflation. That means prices are rising more slowly, they're not falling, and consumers feel a permanent loss of purchasing power at this point. As you heard us discuss at the outset before this talk started, many of you did, housing is really the dominant driver. It's been a decade of underbuilding and restrictive zoning, and now elevated mortgage rates that have really created a structural shortage that monetary policy can't fix. So if you go back to 2008, coming out of the Great Recession, we haven't been building the housing supply like we once did. And that's leading, I think that's the dominant driver in housing and a big part of the affordability crisis. What can policymakers do? Supply shocks that impact eggs as oranges or petroleum, those type of shocks are typically temporary, and they are relative price changes that usually self-correct as supply normalizes. This is really not part of the affordability crisis. Promising to lower prices, as our politicians have been doing lately, promising to lower prices from what was that demand-driven inflation from 2021 to 23 is either economically or illiterate or deliberately misleading. Once you have inflation like we experience, those prices don't go back down to what they were before. What eventually happens, if they're happening simultaneously, what typically happens are nominal wages rise up and catch up with that, and then eventually move ahead of that. But expecting grocery store prices to fall back down and prices on other goods to fall back to where they were in 2021 just is not going to happen. So addressing the housing affordability a crisis really requires more supply side reforms, more zoning, permitting, and construction. Fed rate cuts might have some impact, but it's really not going to affect the overall affordability of housing. Executive orders on prices, again, aren't going to have an impact on addressing the affordability crisis. In fact, kind of somewhat anecdotal data, but again, consistent. If you look at the areas in the countries that have had the fastest growth in new homes, new housing, they also are the ones that have the biggest drops in rent. So if you look at Austin, Texas, Nashville, Charlotte, those are the areas that have been building the most. Those are the areas that have had notable reductions in rents and prices over that time period. So again, one of the best ways to address any type of affordability crisis is to attack things on the supply side. It's better to build than to subsidize in many instances. If you look at South Carolina, again, there's people here who have probably better data than I do on this, but this is some of the data I gathered in preparation for this talk. South Carolina home prices are up roughly 60% above the pre-COVID level. The permanence of that shock mirrors the national inflation story. South Carolina has now fallen out of the top 10 of most affordable states. Redfin ranks them 26, so right about in the middle in its 2025 roundup. The median home sale price in South Carolina was um, about 400,000 in March of 2026, up 2.3% year over year. With a typical home sitting on the market for 76 days, that's down about 17 days. It was 93 days a few months back. The data I could gather in Greenville's median sale price is about 525,000, up just about 0.3% year over year. But price per square foot has climbed 13.5% in that same period. So buyers are paying similar money for less square footage. So again, that's kind of where we are in the South Carolina area. Again, looking at more on building and the housings, South Carolina has offered more than about 800,000 new private housing permits per 100,000 residents over the last little bit about over the last year, a lot more than the national average, and it's one of the highest rates in the Southeast, right alongside with North Carolina. One of the issues, though, in different areas has been temporary construction moratorium across fast-growing communities. And Fort Mill adopted a second pause in March of this year that remains in effect through September 30th. So while, again, we've been pretty successful at building, there's been some resistance in certain areas. Statewide inventory has climbed to roughly 5.4 months of supply from 3.6 months in December 25, moving South Carolina into that 4 to 6 range that's considered to be a healthy and balanced market. And again, this is some of the data that I pulled. Another source of data said our monthly supply of housing is actually below that 3.6, down at about 2.4, but I'm going to go with the number that's a little bit more reliable. And I'll skip that slide just kind of for time. I think you kind of captured how I'm seeing the housing market and some of the affordability issues in the state of South Carolina. If you look at on investment as a part of GDP, so when we think of investment, we think of the purchase of plants, machines, equipment, building of new homes. What you see is the last 3 months here, which I'm highlighting, is investment has been a positive contributor to GDP growth. That is, last month, investment growth contributed more than 0.5% to GDP growth. And in the prior quarter, investment spending on plants, machines, and equipment added 1.3 percentage points to that 2.1 GDP growth number that I presented at the outset. So again, investment has been a positive contributor. You can see the volatility in investment from this graph. And you ask, what has been the positive driver investment? And really, the investment outlook, much of the growth in investment in 2025 is coming from AI equipment. It has added about 40 basis points for GDP growth in each quarter. So to get a sense of this, here is AI investment in just investment in computer equipment. I'm going to call it AI investment. And you can see how big it is over the last few quarters. In one quarter, 2025 Q1, it added almost 1 full percentage point to GDP growth. And the way to put this is in context. Computer equipment is less than 5% of GDP. So in order for that to contribute a full percentage point of GDP growth, the growth in computer equipment investment had to exceed 20%. So if you look at these data, and again, one thing that should jump out at you is this is the highest contribution we've seen in computer equipment. And what I'm referring to here is AI investment. You have to go back to the dot-com boom in the late 1990s to see such growth in this area. if you added other things that would include intellectual property and software data and data centers, AI investment has been adding about 75 basis points to real GDP growth over the last 2 years. And by some measures, you could say it accounted for almost all of GDP growth in 2025. So this AI boom is really one of the things that's helped moving the economy along right now in the face of other headwinds, which I would argue is the higher inflation, the war in Iraq, the tariffs, are things that are acting as a little bit of a drag on the economy. The thing that's really helping us move forward in terms of GDP growth is this AI investment. If you look at the investment outlook for plants, machines, and equipment and for business in general, I think tariff uncertainty still has impacted fixed investment, will continue to impact fixed investment, how we outsource things, where we're outsourcing things from. As we move to just-in-time investment to just-in-case investment, our companies are expected to be a little bit more facile with where they're getting their inputs. The impact of the conflict in Iran is acting as a little bit of drag on investment. Higher petroleum prices have increased the cost, and consumer demand uncertainty has slowed that investment some. But again, we're not as reliant on petroleum and oil prices as we were in the 1970s. There's still some aspects of the one big beautiful bill that are providing some positive direct effect on business investment. Lowering the corporate tax rates maintained in the Tax Act in 2016 with the accelerated depreciation provisions in certain sectors, energy, manufacturing, AI, and tech, has certainly been helping the investment along. Investment tax credits on new facilities before 2026. Now that that's expired, that's not going to be helping as much. Refundable R&D credit again is leading to more R&D investment growth there. And then that 100% depreciation reversing the phase out to 2025 is also good. So the outcomes of all of these have been helping the domestic investment, but really the main thing that has been going on is the surge in AI and the investment in AI that's been moving things along. Changing gears to thinking about employment. As I mentioned, employment has been a little bit of a mixed bag. Here's the long run change in employment going back from 1939 up until the most recent data that came out last week. Again, on average, the economy adds about 130,000 jobs each month. If you focus in on what's been happening over the last, say, 18 months, here's where you see the real weakening of the job market. And again, just kind of give you, numbers to make this picture a little bit more concrete. Coming out of the pandemic, we added 12 million jobs. The next year, we added 7 million, then 4.5, then 2.5. All of that was part of the recovery. In 2024, we went back, I would argue, to kind of what would be normal job creation over the course of the year, adding about 1.5 million jobs. In 2025, that's when things began to stall out some. Over the entire year, we only added 116,000 jobs. So again, remember, on average, we add 135,000 jobs for a whole year. We didn't even add that many as what we normally add in a month. In February of 2026, we saw the economy lose roughly 156,000 jobs. In April of 2026, the economy rebounded and it looked like, okay, the job market's heating back up. We added 362,000 jobs. And then we got the numbers for July came out last week, and we saw the economy actually lost 23,000 jobs. So again, all of this is indicative of a weakening labor market, and one of the things that the Fed is keeping their eye on. Again, this is the same graph, just looking at the last 2.5 years, and what you can see is a lot of up and down in the labor market. From 2024, that all of 2024, what you see there kind of is just like normal job market activity, adding 135,000 jobs, 175,000. It cools a little bit to 87, but it's always positive. What we've seen over 2025 into 2026 is a run of a couple good months and then lose some jobs, gain some jobs, really more up and down again. And this is one thing that the Fed is really concerned about. Another thing that, again, from the 50,000 foot view of an economist, and when we're looking at the labor market, we're also trying to read tea leaves and what's going on. And so not only do we look at overall jobs being created, we're looking also at what's happening on the hiring side and job separation side. So we break separations into quits, which here is the blue line, and layoffs and discharges. And so, if there's one thing, it's kind of the standard running joke I have in a lot of these talks. If there's one thing that economists like, it's quitters, especially when it comes to the job market. Because when we see the quit rate going up, like we do here, the main reason why individuals are willing to quit their job is because they have um, expectations of getting a better job or already have a better job lined up. So when we see the quit rate going up, we think that's a sign of a healthy labor market. And of course, a relatively flat layoff line is also indication that firms aren't laying people off. And so what we saw coming out of that pandemic, if you remember, there was a big jump in quits and people were moving into different jobs. But what we've seen over the last couple years is a pretty dramatic decline in quits, which means, again, to signal to the economists that workers are more concerned about the state of the economy. Job opportunities don't look as attractive as they once were, and that quit rate has dropped. At the same time, if you squint your eyes a little bit and you look at this layoff line, the orangish reddish kind of line, you can see layoffs are rising a little bit. And if you kind of read the local newspapers, you've certainly read some stories about firms laying off workers. So again, one of the things that we're seeing that's also alarming in the labor market is workers aren't quitting at the rate that they once were, and firms are laying off at a higher rate. Another thing that going back to one of the promises of the Trump administration was a resurgence or a hope and resurgence of blue collar jobs. And so, what this graph depicts, and I'll start here in 2022 in January, so all the way over on the left side of the graph, what this represents are the change in blue collar jobs year over year. So, purple is transportation, blue is manufacturing. What you see in this graph is in January of 22 compared to January of 2021, there were 1.2 new blue collar jobs created over the course of the year. And again, manufacturing, mining, construction, utilities, and transportation. And again, part of the aspect and why I have this slide in is one of the promises of the Trump administration or hopes of the Trump administration was the implementation of the tariffs were going to lead to a reshoring of manufacturing jobs and a boost in construction and manufacturing. What you see, though, for the most part, under the beginning of the Trump administration, is that those blue collar jobs we've actually lost blue collar jobs that then gained them. So again, one of the hopes of the tariffs was reshoring of manufacturing and construction jobs as we build new plants and machineries. And while we've heard anecdotes and read stories about new plants being built, the overall data doesn't indicate that the tariffs have been extremely successful in reshoring manufacturing and boosting construction of those plants, machines, and equipment. If I have one area that I'm concerned at, and being a college educator, it certainly is one of the areas, and I have, again, a whole talk that would look at this, is one of the impacts that AI is having on individuals earlier in their career in industries that are going to be sensitive to AI. So I'm looking at jobs that have tasks that AI can do that that we would have entry level workers doing that. I think one example of where we're starting to see this in the data is if you look at total employment in FIBS, which is finance, insurance, information, and business services. What you see is the drop in the pandemic, and then you see those jobs rising back up, coming back up to this, this trend line that I sort of draw in. And then what you have is about this time you have the introduction of Chat GPT, and you can see what happens to jobs and in finance, insurance, information, and business services. Job growth in those areas have slowed and then actually started to decline. So, this covers much of the office and professional side of the economy, banking, insurance, tech, media, consulting, legal and accounting, and administrative support. If you look at these numbers and if you think the trend line is important from 2010 to 20 is the appropriate counterfactual to use, we're about 2.5 million jobs short where we would have been in this area. So again, AI is being disruptive in some sense, and it's slowing down job creation in certain areas. And other areas, it's speeding up. But I think, this is one of the concerns that I have as an economist, is a concern I have as an educator, is going to be what is the overall impact of AI on jobs. My belief is the net effect on overall jobs in the economy, it's not going to have a negative impact. Net effect, I think, will be zero, but there's going to be a lot of creative destruction. Jobs will be created in certain areas and destroyed in other areas. And it's our job, my job here, to think about making sure the people coming out of places like Clemson and other universities have a skill set, have a portfolio that make them ready for the job market, which I think is going to be completely different in 3 to 5 years than what it was, say, 10 years ago. If you look at the South Carolina labor market, South Carolina recorded the fastest population growth of any state between July 24 and 25, 1.5%, driven primarily by domestic in-migration. I'll kind of skip these charts, but what you would see in these pictures here, and I'll go through them kind of quickly, is that almost every county, with the exception of a handful of counties, have had positive net migration flows in from the outside. So again, South Carolina remains a very attractive place to move to. If you look at MSA migration, I mean, we're not Atlanta and Charlotte, but if you look at Greenville, it's doing quite well in terms of MSA migration, people moving into this area. It's an attractive place for people to move. It's a good area where businesses are coming to. It's a great area, again, to raise a family. If you look at households as well, basically the same thing. So again, going beyond that, payroll growth, though, has slowed in the state to 18,000 jobs, or 0.8% year over year. That's down from where we were last year, where we had 2% job growth. So the gains that we've experienced in education and healthcare, leisure and hospitality and government were partly offset, again, by losses in professional and business services and information. Kind of that slide I had earlier. So what I was showing at the nation is also true more locally here. Even so, unemployment in the state fell to 4.4%, fourth consecutive monthly decline. We also, if employment's your better number, we have a record of over 2 million South Carolinians working in Greenville County. The state's largest labor force sits at 3.7%. So unemployment in Greenville is lower. And I'm getting, for sake of time, I want to skip through this. I have about 5 minutes left. So I want to talk a little bit about inflation and what we're seeing with inflation. As I mentioned, inflation is above the Fed's target of 2%. And here's a graph of PCE inflation, which is overall inflation, and core, which strips out the more volatile energy and food inflation. And again, what you see the spike coming out of the pandemic. Things kind of went down a little bit, and now they're picking back up again. Certainly, I would say a contributing factor has been the war in Iran. If you kind of break it down into different components, so the black line here is overall inflation, and you separate inflation into goods inflation and you separate it into service inflation. I think there are two things that are worth pointing out about this graph. Is one is if you look at goods inflation, again, high productivity and lots of imports kept goods inflation low for much of the 2000s. The pandemic led to a spike in goods inflation, and then when things kind of went away, as we returned to normal after the pandemic, goods inflation kind of went back to where it was. But now you see it spiking back up again. Again, a concern. The other concern is, and again, you look at this focus on this graph, is the one thing that we see on service inflation. Service inflation ends up being very sticky. You don't see the big movements in service inflation like you do with goods inflation. So the concern that we had during the pandemic was when service inflation went up, that it was going to stay elevated for some time, and that's exactly what we've seen. So service inflation is really hard to bring down, and that's going to be a real challenge for the Fed. It is going to take some concerted effort. Goods inflation will probably correct itself. Service inflation to bring that down is going to take some work. One of the concerns that the Fed has is that inflation expectations need to be anchored. And what that means is people do a lot of forward planning in terms of how they price things and how they look about things going into the future with respect to prices and wages. Firms and individuals do that. Is if inflation remains anchored, that is, everyone thinks that there's going to be 2% inflation. It's easier for the Fed to keep inflation at 2%. When when inflation becomes unanchored, that means people start building in inflation expectations into contracts and other things that will deviate from that 2%, and it becomes harder for the Fed to control that. When you look at what people are concerned with, and that's what this graph shows here, in the over for much of the last 30 years, from 1990 up to 2020, the most important thing in people's mind has been unemployment. Inflation has not been that important. Again, why would it have been? Inflation had hovered around 2% since the 1990s. If you look at the last 5 years, inflation has overtaken unemployment in terms of what people are concerned about. If you look at this inflation expectations, and this gets back to the idea that inflation expectations really need to be anchored, one of the things that we see is the 1 year ahead forecast got elevated during the pandemic and then came back down and now starts to go back up again. And it seems to be above that 2%, 3% rate. So again, I would say people are more concerned about inflation. To me, I wouldn't say that inflation expectations have become unanchored or unmoored, but people are inflation weary, inflation attentive right now, and so we're at a very delicate place where the Fed is. Again, this is thing. If you look again, how are people thinking about it? If you look at Google searches for inflation, they've gone up dramatically in 2025, 2026. They've gone up just like they did during the pandemic. Again, this is one of the areas I look at to see how people are viewing inflation to make sure those inflation is anchored. Takeaways: it's important that inflation expectations remain anchored. If not, it becomes harder to bring down inflation following supply shocks because people start building that into contracts. The charts seem to indicate that inflation remains anchored, but people, I would say, are inflation scarred. The last 5 years have changed how they feel. They're more concerned about inflation. They're not willing to say they think inflation is going to be at 2%. So long run inflations have not drifted upward. Households are paying more attention to prices, looking up what's going on with inflation. It's a higher baseline than an accelerating rate. So the direction of the Fed, Kevin Warsh typically is a inflation hawk, so having him as the new Fed chair I would say he will be pretty hawkish on trying to bring down inflation. We'll see how that plays out in the coming months. So I got about a minute or two to wrap up. So again, thinking about the Fed's challenge, as I started to talk with, the Fed's dual mandate of stable prices and maximum unemployment is the real challenge that the Fed has. Core inflation, PCE inflation remains elevated above the target rate, starting to rise up again. The labor market, again, that would indicate that the Fed would raise interest rates. The labor market weakening, the monthly payroll numbers, the unemployment rate, and the lower GDP growth would have the Fed leaning toward pushing interest rates down. Again, the Fed's typical playbook: when inflation is high, raise interest rates, slow demand. When job growth slows, cut rates to stimulate demand. And this is that rock and the hard place I was talking about. The current dilemma: inflation is sticky. Labor market is showing signs of softening. So the Fed, they have Powell's stance. I should have changed it to Warsh's stance, is going to be cautious again. I think next time the Fed meets, they're going to be probably leaning more toward interest rate cuts. And then here's a chart I will leave, kind of end things with, is this blue line here is the current path of inflation in the US. This orange line here is the inflation rate from 1971 to 1984. Wow. Again, I don't want to put a lot of stock in a graph like this. I think the Fed is clearly aware of this figure. I know they are. I know that economists are aware of this figure. And the one thing that they don't want to repeat is that period of 71 to 84, where you have rising inflation rates, high mortgage rates. And so again, I think the Fed is going to be pretty proactive in trying to bring inflation down. But again, they can only do that is if employment is growing at modest rates, the economy is growing at modest rates, and maybe that's why we hope AI could really boost productivity and help move us along. So again, that was kind of a quick run through everything, trying to get through as many things as possible. Lots of moving parts going on right now. Happy to take any questions that you have. And I want to again thank 10 at the Top for having me. Thank all of you for joining in for today. Again, I always look forward to these talks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott, for all that great information. We do have one question right now in the chat. So if anyone else has any questions, please put them in the chat. So the question is from, looks like Diana Curell. Could you give your input on the AI bubble and what a potential burst could mean?
Yeah, I do worry a little bit about the AI bubble, but I think I would be more concerned now about some of the national resistance to building up of data centers and staying on the frontiers of AI. I think for the overall economy, I think AI is going to be important in the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm more concerned about not being on the frontiers, not doing as much as we can to build up our AI infrastructure than an AI bubble.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us in different communities around, of course, data centers have been at the top of those conversations. I know here in Greenwood, that has been a huge conversation. Right now in our area, there is a moratorium for a year in place that was just passed. And I know a lot of other communities also right now have a moratorium in place. And so that's definitely a conversation. And I'll mention too, yesterday we had a state of higher ed conversation with Lander University and Piedmont Technical College here, as well as the president of the South Carolina Commission on Higher Ed. And one of the things from an educational piece we talked about was how quickly as well, and you kind of mentioned it, Scott, too, how quickly can our educational systems, keep changing the curriculum as quickly as technology is evolving to make sure students are well versed as well as to what the demands of the industries are as well. And so I think when we look at some of those data centers and putting those in different areas around the state too, do we have a qualified workforce as well,
That's right, yeah.
to help, after those data centers are in place? And so that's a great conversation as far as how, the data centers impact the economy, impact our workforce, and some of those other things as well.
Yeah, there was a recent paper published by at the National Bureau of Economic Research that looked at the economic impact of data centers. And again, the overall finding was, they don't come without cost, that's clear. But net, the overall economic impact in terms of job creation and employment, they ended up being, a net positive, and the effect on local energy prices didn't seem to be as high as what we read in the papers. Now, I'm not here to carry the water on data centers. I'm not a paid sponsor, and again, I wouldn't want one necessarily in my own backyard, but I think it's important to again realize how important AI is going to be for our future. And again, from the land grant mission of Clemson, I think is from an education standpoint, I think we're facing dual, how do we, as I tell my students, is AI isn't going to take your job, but someone who knows AI will. And so I think we need to equip our students. We need to have an educated workforce, more exec education, and in terms of how you use AI in a day-to-day way that makes our workforce more productive. Again, it will be disruptive, but I think there are real opportunities, in the state, nationwide, but in the state here to really upskill our labor force using AI, especially with all the advanced manufacturing we do and the financial services that in Greenville, I think is a real opportunity.
Any other questions? Going once, twice. All right. Well, I think Justine, I think you're on. I'll give one announcement as well before we close out. And just be sure that you look out for the registration for our next 10 at the top chat, which will be September 10th with Zach Prince from the Greenville Triumph and Liberty and Rivers Hughes, from Hughes Investments, sharing about the Upstate's professional soccer teams and their new home at Bridgeway Station. So that date again is September 10th. So be on the lookout for that. So Justine, any other announcements that you have from your end?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. I'm kind of on the computer and the phone and trying to get all the things to work properly. I did put the link in the chat for all other upcoming events, including the next TAT chat that I think we have a registration set up for. Please check those out. And to any of you nonprofits out there who aren't familiar with our Elevate Upstate grants, there's a workshop going on in a couple minutes. So obviously you don't need to be at that, but we will have the grant application online, hopefully tomorrow. And you can learn more about that and other events that are coming up. So thank you so much again, Scott. We'd love to hear what you have to say, your education. We're in an area here in the upstate where it's kind of all wine and roses, and it's hard to remember that that might not necessarily be the case in other places. So thanks very much, Tracy, and everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Everybody have a great rest of the day.
Bye, everyone.
But thanks.
Thanks, Scott.